The light was blinding. It poured down from the Algerian sky with the full weight of summer, even in winter. It wrapped itself around the whitewashed walls of Algiers, made the pale stones burn to the touch, and turned the narrow streets into corridors of gold. The sea just beyond shimmered with a restlessness that seemed eternal. Waves broke in slow rhythm against the harbour, sending a salt-heavy wind up toward the hills, carrying with it the metallic tang of brine and the faint sweetness of orange blossom. In the midst of this light, a boy stood watching, his gaze fixed not on the ships, but on the horizon where the sky and the water met. His name was Albert Camus, though in 1913, when he was born in the small coastal town of Mondovì, no one could have guessed that he would become one of the century's most enduring voices. What defined his earliest years was not fame, but absence. His father, Lucien, had been a vineyard worker, a man who earned his bread under the same sun that now bathed his son's face. When war erupted in Europe, Lucien was sent to fight in the trenches of the Marne. He would die there, struck down before Albert was even old enough to form a memory of him. All that remained was a photograph and the silence his absence left behind. His mother, Catherine, nearly deaf and unable to read or write, kept the household together with quiet resilience, cleaning houses for the wealthier families of Algiers. She spoke little, moved softly, and bore life's weight without complaint. Camus would later say that from her he learned the dignity of silence, the understanding that not all truths need to be spoken, and that some forms of strength are almost invisible. But he also learned to listen in other ways, to the sigh of the sea at night, to the creak of shutters in the wind, to the way a street changes its voice when the sun begins to fall. The family lived in the working-class district of Belcourt, in a cramped apartment shared with his grandmother and uncle. The stairwells smelled of dust and boiled chickpeas, and the voices of neighbours carried easily through thin walls. Outside, however, the world was alive. Vendors called out in a mix of French and Arabic, their voices tangled with the clatter of carts and the cries of children playing barefoot on the pavement. The city was a collision of cultures, colonial France superimposed on North Africa, its beauty sharpened by its tensions. Albert's escape came through school. From the start, it was clear he had a quick mind and an appetite for stories. His teacher, Louis Germain, recognized this and made it his mission to keep the boy in class despite his family's lack of means. In time, Germain would become one of the quiet heroes in Camus's life. Decades later, after winning the Nobel Prize, Camus would write him a letter. "Without you, without that loving hand you extended to the small. Poor child that I was, without your teaching and example, none of all this would have happened." Books opened worlds far beyond Algiers, worlds of snow, of mountains, of distant wars, and forgotten empires. Yet Camus never abandoned the Mediterranean that shaped him. He swam in its waters, felt its salt drying on his skin, and memorized the way light could transform a street from bleak to beautiful in the space of an hour. The light was not merely brightness, it was a lens through which the world was stripped bare. It left no place to hide, neither for beauty nor for injustice. At 17, the brightness dimmed. He was struck by tuberculosis, a disease that, in the 1930s, carried no promise of cure. The fevers came in waves, his lungs weakened, and for months he lived under the shadow of early death. He recovered enough to resume his studies, but the illness had carved something permanent into him, the knowledge that life could be taken at any moment. This awareness, sharp, unavoidable, would become the quiet pulse beneath much of his later work. Even as he regained strength, he knew he could never join the military or hold certain jobs that required perfect health. The future would have to be built differently. He turned to writing with greater urgency, producing essays, short stories, and plays with a clarity unusual for his age. In these works, the sea often appeared, as did the sun, symbols of beauty, of desire, and of the strange loneliness that lingers even in paradise. The 1930s were restless years for him. He studied philosophy at the University of Algiers, gravitating toward questions of justice, truth, and the meaning of life. His thesis explored Plotinus and Saint Augustine, contrasting pagan joy with Christian introspection, Mediterranean sunlight with the shadows of Rome. Yet he was not content to live only in books. The streets called to him as much as the library. Camus became involved with theatre, co-founding the Théâtre du Travail, the workers' theatre, believing that the stage could speak directly to the people. He acted, directed, and wrote plays that sought to make moral questions tangible. At the same time, he worked as a journalist, writing investigative pieces about poverty and colonial inequality in Algeria. His reports were vivid and unflinching, describing families crammed into single rooms, children without shoes, and the stark contrast between French privilege and Arab deprivation. These contradictions gnawed at him. France proclaimed liberty, equality, fraternity. Yet here, under the Algerian sun, those ideals withered in the glare of reality. He could not reconcile the rhetoric with the truth he saw daily. And so he began to write about the absurd, not yet as a formal philosophy, but as a felt reality, the gap between human longing and the world's indifference. By the late 1930s, his tuberculosis flared again, forcing him to seek cleaner air in the countryside. The rhythm of convalescence, reading, writing, walking slowly in the sun, only deepened his resolve. If time was short, then each day mattered all the more. Life's value was not in promises of eternity, but in the immediacy of touch, sight, taste, and love. In 1940, with the shadow of war falling over Europe, Camus left Algeria for metropolitan France. He carried with him the scent of the sea, the memory of light on white walls, and the tensions of a land divided. Paris was colder, its light softer, its streets lined with stone rather than dust. Yet beneath the city's grey sky, the questions he had been asking since boyhood grew sharper. What does it mean to live, knowing life has no ultimate guarantee? How does one remain human in a world that so easily crushes dignity? He would soon be forced to find answers not in theory, but in action. The German army was advancing. France itself was collapsing. And Albert Camus, the young man who had grown up in the blinding light of the Mediterranean, was about to step into a darkness that would test every belief he held. The war was no longer a rumour, it was here. And with it came the moment when the philosopher would be called to become something more. Paris in 1940 was not the Paris of postcards. The streets were quieter now, and the air carried a different weight, thicker, tense, and heavy with the knowledge that the world was shifting underfoot. Shop fronts that once glowed with evening light now seemed cautious in their illumination. Conversations too had changed. Words were measured. Eyes darted quickly before looking away. Albert Camus arrived in the city just as France was bracing for the unimaginable. The war, which had seemed distant to many, was suddenly a pressing reality. The German army's advance through Europe was swift, precise, and relentless. The very air seemed to tremble with uncertainty. For Camus, fresh from the blinding light of Algeria, the grey pall of occupied Paris was a new kind of exile, not from geography, but from the sense of openness he had always known. His health remained fragile. Tuberculosis, that quiet predator, was never far from his thoughts. And he knew that prolonged cold and damp could bring it roaring back. Yet illness was only one shadow he faced. The greater one was morale, how to live and act under tyranny without losing oneself. At first, Camus worked as a reporter for Paris Soir, travelling across France to write human interest stories. But the news itself was growing darker each day. He saw the effects of displacement, families trudging along roads, carrying what little they could, their lives reduced to bundles and the hope of safety somewhere ahead. He witnessed the quiet despair in cafes, where men and women sipped coffee as if holding on to the last remnants of normal life. When Paris fell to the Germans in June 1940, the city became a stage for both visible and invisible battles. Some collaborated openly, draped in the rhetoric of survival. Others resisted quietly, their defiance hidden in coded letters, whispered meetings, and clandestine press rooms. Camus, still relatively unknown as a writer, was already shaping the moral compass that would define him. He believed that to live without resistance under oppression was to surrender not only one's freedom, but one's dignity. In 1942, his path led him to the resistance newspaper Combat. Under the editorship of figures like Pascal Piat, Combat became more than a publication. It was a lifeline of truth in a city drowned in propaganda. The Apoisia paper circulated secretly, its words carried from hand to hand like contraband fire. Camus wrote editorials that were not only sharp in argument, but rich in humanity, appealing to the moral responsibility of each reader. He did not call for vengeance, but for clarity. Clarity that oppression was not fate, and that even in defeat, moral choice remained. But the dangers were immense. Printing and distributing Combat meant risking arrest, torture, and execution. Meetings were held in dim back rooms, where typewriters clattered softly and the smell of ink mixed with the sharper scent of fear. At any moment, the door could burst open. Camus accepted the risk, convinced that silence was a deeper betrayal than death. It was during this period that he began to articulate more fully what would become his philosophy of the absurd. War made its presence felt in every breath. Life's fragility was no longer abstract. It was in the sudden knock at the door, in the footsteps echoing too long in the hallway, in the absence of a friend who had been there yesterday. Against this backdrop, the question was not why life was absurd, but how one should live knowing that it was. Camus's answer was action. To act, not in blind rage, not in nihilistic despair, but in conscious defiance. This defiance was not the promise of victory, but the refusal to surrender one's humanity. In Combat, he wrote, "In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer." These were not empty words. They were forged in a time when winter was both literal and moral. He also found himself wrestling with another truth. The enemy was not only the foreign occupier. Injustice had deeper roots: colonialism, inequality, and the complacency of those who benefited from systems that crushed others. His Algerian upbringing had taught him this long before he set foot in Paris. Now, in the crucible of war, the lesson returned sharper than ever. In 1942, Camus published The Stranger, his first novel. Written partly in Algiers and finished in Paris, it told the story of Meursault, a man detached from conventional morality, whose emotional indifference collides with society's demand for meaning. The novel's stark prose mirrored the stripped-down truth of war, that life could be both meaningless and yet unbearably precious. In the same year, he released The Myth of Sisyphus, his philosophical essay that crystallized his thinking. There, he wrote of the absurd as the confrontation between the human desire for clarity and the silent, indifferent world. The only answer, he argued, was to live fully in spite of it, to imagine Sisyphus happy, pushing his rock up the hill forever. These works did not emerge from the safety of an academic desk. They were born in a city under occupation, in the tension between the inked page and the possibility of arrest, and they were received with a mixture of fascination and unease. Camus was not offering comfort. He was offering a mirror. Life in occupied Paris was an intricate dance. Food was scarce, curfews were strict, and the presence of German soldiers was constant. Cafes became quiet havens for coded conversations. Camus often met friends and fellow resistors in such places, speaking in half sentences, their eyes scanning the room for anyone listening too intently. Trust was currency, and betrayal could come from a neighbour. Yet amid the danger, there were moments of deep human connection. He fell in love with Francine Faure, a pianist and teacher from Oran, whose warmth and strength provided a fragile anchor in turbulent waters. They married in 1940, and though their relationship would later be tested, in these years she was a constant presence, a reminder that even in war, tenderness survived. By 1944, as the Allies advanced, Paris was preparing for liberation. Camus, at combat, was at the heart of the city's intellectual resistance. The paper became an open voice once the Germans retreated, its clandestine days giving way to public debates about France's future. Camus called for justice without revenge, for rebuilding without repeating the mistakes that had led to collapse. His words urged the French to look inward as well as outward, to see not only the enemy in uniform, but the failures within their own society. The liberation brought euphoria, but also reckoning. Collaborators were punished, sometimes brutally. Camus stood firm in his belief that justice must not descend into vengeance, that the moral high ground won during the resistance could be lost in the intoxication of victory. His editorials during this period remain among his most principled, refusing to let triumph erase the need for self-examination. Through it all, the shadow of tuberculosis persisted. Even in moments of celebration, his health could falter, forcing him to step back. This physical limitation, rather than weakening him, seemed to sharpen his sense of urgency. He wrote as if each work could be his last, as if each article, each novel, each philosophical essay had to carry its full weight in the present moment. By the war's end, Albert Camus was no longer an obscure Algerian journalist. He had become a moral voice for France, a writer who had lived his philosophy in the most dangerous of circumstances. Yet he knew that peace was not an ending. It was merely a new terrain for the same questions. How to live without illusions. How to resist injustice when it no longer wears an enemy's uniform. The guns had fallen silent, but the absurd had not retreated. And for Camus, the next battle would not be fought in the shadows of war, but in the blinding light of peace, a light that, like the Mediterranean sun of his youth, revealed everything, including the flaws people preferred not to see. The war was over, or so they said. In the streets of Paris, flags bloomed like sudden flowers, bright against the soot-stained buildings. Crowds surged in, celebration spilling into squares and boulevards. The sound of voices, cheering, laughing, weeping, rose and fell like waves. Soldiers returned, some to open arms, others to empty doorways. Shops reopened, music returned to cafes, and life began in small ways to resemble what it had been before. But peace, Albert Camus understood, was never simply the absence of war. It carried its own weight, a different kind of heaviness. The moral clarity of resistance had been replaced by the murkiness of rebuilding. The enemy had been obvious during the occupation. Now it was harder to name. Camus, who had risked his life in the shadows of combat, found himself in a new role, a public figure whose words were read not in secret, but openly on newsstands. Combat had gone from an underground paper to a legitimate daily publication, and Camus continued as one of its most distinctive voices. But the clandestine intensity of the resistance was gone. In its place came politics, messy, often petty, and full of compromises that made him uneasy. He had not fought to see France slip into complacency or self-congratulation. His editorials reflected that unease. He argued for justice without cruelty, warned against the intoxication of vengeance, and urged the French to remember that freedom was a responsibility, not a prize to be stored away until the next crisis. This was not always welcome. Many wanted heroes to be uncritical, to endorse the collective mood. Camus would not play that role. He refused to align himself fully with any political party, mistrusting ideological purity when it blinded people to human suffering. His distance from both the Communist Party and the Gaullists earned him enemies on both sides. Yet he believed independence of mind was the only true allegiance a writer could have. The years immediately after the war were also years of intense literary productivity. In 1947, he published The Plague, a novel set in the Algerian city of Oran, where an outbreak of disease forces the population into quarantine. On its surface, it was a story of epidemic and endurance, but beneath, it was a meditation on resistance, solidarity, and the persistence of human dignity in the face of relentless, indifferent forces. For many, the novel read as an allegory of life under occupation. The pestilence was the occupier, the quarantine, the blockade, the small acts of courage, the resistance itself. The success of The Plague brought Camus international recognition. Yet even as his reputation grew, he remained wary of the role fame could play in distorting one's voice. He had no taste for becoming a celebrity philosopher. For him, writing was not performance. It was a form of moral work. In interviews, he often deflected personal questions, preferring to talk about ideas, literature, and the ethical demands of the present. At the same time, his personal life was far from serene. His marriage to Francine Faure was under strain, not only from the years of war, but from his own restlessness. Camus was a man who loved deeply, but also found it difficult to remain bound to one person. Affairs and emotional entanglements complicated his home life, leaving Francine to carry a quiet burden. He loved his children, twins born in 1945, yet the demands of his work often kept him away for long stretches. And then there was his health. Tuberculosis remained an unpredictable adversary. Periodic flare-ups forced him into periods of convalescence, sometimes in the south of France, sometimes back in Algeria. These enforced retreats were double-edged. They robbed him of momentum, but also gave him time for reflection. In the stillness, he thought about the direction France was taking, about the widening gap between its ideals and its realities. The post-war world was shaping into something new, and something troubling. The Cold War was tightening its grip on Europe, and the ideological divide between East and West demanded that intellectuals choose sides. For many French writers and thinkers, communism seemed the natural ally in the struggle against fascism's lingering shadow. But Camus could not accept the moral compromises he believed the Soviet system demanded. He saw in Stalinism the same machinery of oppression he had fought against in Nazi rule, only with different symbols. This refusal to fall in line put him increasingly at odds with former friends. Most painful among these ruptures was his break with Jean-Paul Sartre. The two men had once shared a mutual admiration. Sartre for Camus's moral clarity, Camus for Sartre's intellectual daring. They moved in overlapping circles, discussed literature and politics late into the night, and seemed for a time to be allies in shaping the post-war French intellectual landscape. But the publication of Camus's The Rebel in 1951 changed everything. In it, he explored the history of rebellion, how noble causes could become monstrous when they demanded absolute loyalty or justified violence in the name of utopia. He argued that true rebellion was not about replacing one tyranny with another, but about preserving limits, respecting the value of each human life. To Sartre and his allies on the left, this sounded dangerously like political caution at a time when they believed revolutionary commitment was necessary. Their disagreement spilled into public view, with sharp critiques printed in journals, and the friendship shattering beyond repair. The rupture left Camus isolated. The Parisian intellectual scene could be brutal to those who stood apart. Yet he refused to adjust his stance to regain favour. The cost of independence, he believed, was solitude, and he was willing to pay it. Still, there were moments of grace. Camus travelled, lectured, and found solace in the sea. In the summers, he returned to the Mediterranean, letting its light and warmth dissolve some of the tensions of Paris. There, among the rocky coastlines and small harbours, he could breathe more easily, both physically and spiritually. The sea reminded him of the simplicity beneath all the noise, the feel of sunlight on skin, the salt drying on his arms, the rhythm of waves against stone. These were the constants in a life increasingly shaped by political storms. Peace, he saw, was deceptive. It could be filled with conflicts as sharp as those in wartime, only fought with words and ideas rather than guns. And in some ways, these conflicts were more dangerous. Wars announce themselves. They march into cities. The erosion of justice in peacetime is quieter, often unnoticed, until it has gone too far. Camus carried this awareness into everything he wrote in these years. His plays, Caligula, The Just Assassins, posed moral dilemmas in the form of drama, forcing audiences to confront uncomfortable questions about power, justice, and the price of action. His essays returned again and again to the themes of limits, responsibility, and the necessity of truth in a world eager to embrace convenient lies. By the mid-1950s, the questions that had haunted him since youth were pressing more urgently than ever. France was entering another kind of war, this one in Algeria, his birthplace. The struggle for independence there would test him in ways both personal and political. His love for Algeria was deep, but so was his commitment to justice. And between those two, he would find himself caught, unable to satisfy either side without betraying the other. The weight of peace had shifted into the weight of choice, a choice between loyalty to the land of his birth and loyalty to the principles that had guided him all his life. It was a choice that promised no victory, only loss. But for now, in the early years after World War II, Camus continued to write, to speak, to push back against the easy narratives of triumph. He knew that the real work began after the celebrations ended, that freedom, once won, could be lost again not only through conquest, but through neglect. And somewhere beyond the political debates, beyond the pages of newspapers and the glare of intellectual feuds, the sea still waited for him, unchanged, indifferent, eternal. The same sea he had watched as a boy, standing under the blinding Algerian sun, wondering even then how one could live fully in a world that offered beauty and suffering in the same breath. Soon that question would return to him with a force he could not yet imagine. Because in Algeria, the first sparks of revolt had already begun to burn. The first sparks were small, too small, some thought, to ignite anything larger. In the early 1950s, the streets of Algiers still bustled under the midday sun. The cafes still served their bitter coffee, and the call to prayer still rose, soft and unwavering, over the rooftops. On the surface, life in French Algeria went on much as it had for decades. But beneath that surface, the air was warming, not with summer's heat, but with the friction of a people growing restless. Albert Camus knew these streets as intimately as the lines of his own hands. The narrow lanes of the Casbah, the broad, sea-facing boulevards, the smell of grilled sardines curling up from market stalls, these were the scents and sounds of his boyhood. And yet, returning now as a celebrated writer, he could not see them without also seeing the cracks. The inequality between French settlers and the Arab population was sharper than ever. The promises of liberty and fraternity, repeated like a ritual in Paris, had never fully reached these shores. The tensions were not new. Camus had written about them years before, in his journalism and essays, warning that poverty and injustice were seeds that could not be ignored. But those warnings had been met with polite disinterest, or worse, with the complacent conviction that colonial order was eternal. Now the seeds had sprouted and the roots ran deep. In 1954, the National Liberation Front, the FLN, launched its armed struggle for Algerian independence. Bombings, assassinations, and reprisals followed. The war was both visible and invisible. In the sudden crack of gunfire on a city street, in the quiet disappearance of a neighbour, in the way conversations grew cautious overnight. French soldiers patrolled with wary eyes. FLN fighters moved in shadows. Every street corner became a place of potential danger. For Camus, the war was not a distant abstraction. It was a personal rupture. Algeria was his birthplace, his first landscape, the wellspring of his light and imagery. But it was also a place divided, where the privileges of his French heritage had been built upon the dispossession of others. His mother still lived there, in the working-class quarters of Algiers, far from the safety of Parisian salons. Her life, quiet and poor, would be directly threatened by the violence now unfolding. From the beginning, Camus refused to take the easy positions demanded by the conflict. The left in France expected him to support full independence for Algeria without hesitation. The right wanted him to defend the French presence as a civilizing mission. Camus could not give either what they wanted. He believed that independence was inevitable and just, but he also feared the cycle of violence it would unleash, and the reprisals that would endanger civilians on both sides. He called for a civilian truce, an end to attacks on non-combatants, a pause in the bloodshed so that negotiations could be pursued. His proposal was met with hostility from nearly everyone. To the French settlers, it sounded like betrayal. To the FLN, it sounded like delay. The Parisian intellectual left, already suspicious of his political independence, accused him of cowardice, of refusing to commit. But Camus's position was not born of fear. It was born of the same principle that had guided him in the resistance, that human life was sacred, and that no political victory could justify its deliberate destruction. In January 1956, he travelled to Algiers to speak publicly in support of the truce. The hall was packed, the air tense. Some came to listen, others to shout him down. Outside, the streets roiled with protests. He spoke calmly, urging an end to attacks on civilians, reminding the audience that justice could not be built on indiscriminate killing. But the room erupted in anger. Shouts drowned his voice. The meeting broke down before it could truly begin. He left shaken, not by the rejection itself, which he had expected, but by the depth of the rage he had witnessed. Algeria was no longer the place of his boyhood. It was a battlefield, and the lines were drawn so sharply that to stand between them was to stand alone. The war escalated. In the countryside, French forces waged brutal campaigns against FLN fighters, employing torture, mass arrests, and scorched earth tactics. In the cities, bombs exploded in cafes and markets. Each act of violence was answered with another. Camus followed the news obsessively, scanning for mention of attacks near his mother's neighbourhood. He feared every letter that took too long to arrive. His writing during these years bore the mark of this strain. While he continued to publish essays and plays, there was a new tightness in his prose, as if each sentence carried the weight of unspoken worry. Publicly, he avoided making grand declarations about the war, knowing that in such a polarized climate, every word could be weaponized. Privately, he lamented the loss of reason on both sides. In 1957, the world turned its gaze toward him in a way he had never sought. The Swedish Academy awarded him the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was only 44, one of the youngest recipients in the prize's history. The citation praised his clear-sighted earnestness and his work in illuminating the problems of the human conscience in our time. For many writers, this would have been a moment of unalloyed triumph. For Camus, it was complicated. The Nobel brought international attention, yes, but also amplified the voices of his critics. During his visit to Stockholm, a young Algerian student publicly confronted him, accusing him of defending colonial oppression. Camus responded with words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I have always condemned terror. I must also condemn the terrorism that strikes blindly in the streets of Algiers, and that might one day strike my mother or my family. I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice." The statement was seized upon by his detractors as proof of bias, of sentiment blinding him to principle. But for Camus it was no confession of hypocrisy. It was an acknowledgement of the moral limits he had always spoken about. No ideology, however righteous, could demand the sacrifice of the innocent. The noble also forced him to confront another truth. He was, despite his moral convictions, powerless to stop the war. His calls for moderation went largely unheard. The violence rolled on, indifferent to the appeals of philosophers or prize winners. And so he withdrew further from the political stage, focusing on his writing, his family, and the quiet spaces where he could still think without the roar of public expectation. Yet Algeria never left him. In letters, in private conversations, in the margins of his notebooks, the country's name appeared again and again. The sunlight, the sea, the poverty, the injustice, all of it was wound tightly into his sense of self. The war was not only a political tragedy, it was a personal bereavement. By the late 1950s, the conflict had become one of the most bitter decolonization struggles of the century. The French government, unwilling to concede, poured resources into crushing the rebellion. The FLN, equally determined, escalated its campaign. The casualty lists grew longer. The possibility of a peaceful resolution seemed ever more remote. For Camus, the Algerian fire was not just a matter of politics or even morality. It was a test of everything he had ever believed about the absurd, about limits, about the need to live without illusions. Here was the absurd in its rawest form, a land he loved, tearing itself apart. Two peoples locked in a struggle where victory for one meant ruin for the other. A man caught between them, unable to choose without betraying some essential part of himself. The war would not end in his lifetime. And though he tried to distance himself from the public fray, the fire continued to burn in him, shaping his later works with a kind of sorrow that never fully healed. In the years to come, he would seek other landscapes, other stories, perhaps in the hope that distance might quiet the ache. But Algeria was the wound that light could not close, and it was from that wound that some of his most haunting words would come. For now, in the late 1950s, Camus lived in the uneasy space between acclaim and alienation, between the Nobel's golden glow and the shadow of a war he could neither fight nor flee. The sea still called to him, as it always had, but its horizon no longer promised escape. It promised only the knowledge that some distances cannot be crossed, not by ships, not by words, not even by love. And yet, somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the bombs and speeches, he still believed in a fragile, stubborn hope, that even in the fiercest fire, there might be, if not peace, then at least the refusal to become what one fights against. Fame had come like an unexpected tide, first a slow swell, then a sudden, forceful wave that lifted him high above the shoreline, where he had once stood unnoticed. The Nobel Prize had made Albert Camus a name known not just in France, but across continents. His books were translated into dozens of languages. Invitations arrived from universities, publishers, and governments. Lectures, interviews, photographs. These became as much a part of his life as the quiet hours with pen and paper. And yet for Camus, fame was not a home. It was another kind of exile. In Algeria, he was mistrusted for refusing to declare absolute allegiance to independence. In France, he was resented by many on the left for breaking with communism and opposing revolutionary violence. Among Parisian intellectuals, the rupture with Sartre had left him isolated from the most influential literary circle of the age. The Nobel had given him a global platform, but also magnified the loneliness that came with holding to a position no one wished to share. The world wanted him to speak for it, or against it, on every subject. Every public appearance seemed to invite a test of loyalty. He would be asked about the Cold War, about Soviet repression in Hungary, about the Algerian War, and about the moral responsibilities of artists. Each answer was measured against the ideological ledger of the questioner, and often found wanting. Camus had no interest in passing these tests. He spoke in the language of limits and nuance, not absolutes. For some, this was courage. For others, it was evasion. The truth was simpler. Camus did not believe a writer's role was to be the mouthpiece of a party or a government. A writer, he thought, should be a witness, one who tells what is seen and refuses to lie about it. The witness must stand apart, even if that means standing alone. His refusal to be pulled into the ideological extremes of his time set him apart in an era that increasingly demanded binary loyalties. The Cold War turned every debate into a battle between two poles, East or West, communism or capitalism, liberation or colonialism. Camus rejected the idea that the human conscience could be reduced to such choices. This refusal baffled those who thrived on moral clarity, defined by side-taking. Despite the tensions, the late 1950s were prolific years for him. He completed The Fall in 1956, a short but piercing novel that took the form of a confession from a disillusioned Parisian lawyer named Camus. Set in Amsterdam's damp, echoing streets, the book was a meditation on hypocrisy, guilt, and the ease with which moral conviction can decay into moral posturing. Critics saw in Clémence a shadow of Camus himself, an exile wandering far from home, speaking to a world that might listen but would not forgive. There was an edge of weariness in his work now. The early sunlit clarity of The Stranger had given way to a deeper, more troubled introspection. His essays reflected the same shift. Pieces like Reflections on the Guillotine challenged the death penalty, not with abstract theory, but with an unflinching look at its brutality and futility. In an age when government still executed prisoners in public squares or behind locked prison gates, Camus's voice was a clear and stubborn opposition. His private life remained turbulent. His marriage to Francine endured, but more in form than in ease. Camus's infidelities were an open secret in Parisian literary circles, and his relationships, intense, fleeting, sometimes overlapping, often left emotional wreckage. Yet, for all the complications, Francine was still a constant in his life, a link to the years before the Nobel, before the intellectual battles, before the war. She was also the mother of his children, and despite his absences, Camus was deeply attached to them, protective of their innocence in a world he knew could strip it away without warning. When his health allowed, he sought refuge in travel. He lectured in Sweden, Italy, and the United States. The journeys gave him perspective, and sometimes relief from the suffocating scrutiny of Paris. In America, he was struck by the vastness of the landscape and the openness of conversation, though he was wary of the country's own political myths. In Italy, he wandered among ruins and piazzas, finding in their beauty an echo of the Mediterranean that had shaped him. Everywhere he carried notebooks, jotting impressions, fragments of ideas, observations of people and places that might one day find their way into fiction. But fame brought not only invitations, it also brought expectation. Publishers wanted the next major novel, something to stand alongside The Plague and The Stranger. Readers wrote to him with gratitude, but also with demands that he confirm their interpretations, that he align himself with their causes. Camus resisted. He had no desire to be the prophet of the absurd or the moral conscience of the West. He wrote what he could, when he could, guided by the same quiet conviction he had carried from his days in the Resistance. To tell the truth as he saw it, and to tell it clearly. The political landscape continued to shift. In 1956, the Soviet Union crushed the Hungarian uprising with tanks and gunfire, killing thousands. The event confirmed for Camus what he had long suspected, that the ideals of communist revolution could be betrayed as easily as the ideals of any other power. He condemned the suppression without hesitation, earning further enmity from those who still clung to the hope of a purer socialism. His position was consistent. Injustice was injustice, no matter the flag under which it marched. The Algerian War, meanwhile, only grew bloodier. News from Algiers arrived like a slow, grim drumbeat. His calls for a civilian truce had been ignored. Violence had become the primary language of both sides. The French government intensified its military campaign, and the FLN responded with more bombings and assassinations. The war was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It was the reality of daily life in the city of his birth. For Camus, the Nobel had changed nothing where it mattered most. His mother still lived in harm's way, and each escalation brought the danger closer. In this period, he began to withdraw more noticeably from public political engagement. It was not that his convictions had weakened, they had in fact sharpened, but he saw less and less use in speaking into a storm that refused to listen. Instead, he turned his energy to creative projects that had been long delayed. He returned to the theatre, adapting and directing plays, and began shaping the first drafts of a work that would never be completed in his lifetime. The First Man, a semi-autobiographical novel that would explore his childhood in Algeria with an intimacy and detail he had never before allowed himself. There was a longing in him now, a pull toward the origins he could not return to without also returning to the wound. In letters to friends, he wrote of the sea, of the light, of the smell of the Algerian streets after rain. But the Algeria he remembered was gone, replaced by a country in flames. By the end of the decade, Camus's relationship with fame had hardened into something like endurance. He accepted its presence in his life the way one accepts a climate, sometimes pleasant, sometimes oppressive, always inescapable. It brought opportunities to speak, to publish, to travel. It also brought distortion, the constant risk of being misunderstood or reduced to a symbol. Camus knew that symbols, once fixed in the public imagination, rarely survive as living men. And so, in these final years of the 1950s, he lived in a kind of double exile, exiled from Algeria by war and exiled from the Parisian literary establishment by principle. He was a man apart, recognized everywhere, but at home nowhere. The Nobel had given him a crown, but it was one that sat uneasily, reminding him daily that the price of independence was not only solitude, but the slow erosion of belonging. Yet there were still mornings when he would wake, feel the light on the wall, and remember the boy who had stood by the sea in Algiers watching the horizon. That boy had not dreamed of fame or prizes or the weight of public expectation. He had dreamed, perhaps, only of understanding the strange mixture of beauty and grief that life seemed to offer in equal measure. Now, with the world watching him, he carried that same question forward, knowing that answers were never final. The work was to keep asking, to keep looking toward the horizon, even when the tide turned against him. What he could not know was that his time to ask would be shorter than anyone expected, and that the end would come not in the form of illness, nor in the violence of war, but suddenly, on a quiet road in winter. In the final years of the 1950s, Albert Camus began to circle back towards something he had never fully left, the landscape of his childhood. It was not nostalgia that pulled him, nor the vain desire to relive what had passed. Rather, it was a deeper calling, a need to return to the first soil, the first light, and see it clearly before time closed its door. He had spent years navigating the storms of politics, philosophy, and fame. But beneath all of it, Algeria still waited, unchanged in essence, if not in form. Camus had always drawn on this place in his work: the sea, the sun, the stark outlines of rock against a blue sky. These images lived in his novels and essays as naturally as breath. Yet now, as the war in Algeria raged on, he felt an urgency to capture it more directly. Not the Algeria of newsreels or political speeches, but the Algeria of memory. The dusty schoolyards, the smell of bread baking in small neighbourhood ovens, the slow rhythm of afternoons when the heat drove everyone into the shade. The project that began to take shape in his mind was a novel, and more than a novel, a reckoning. He called it The First Man. It would be, in part, his own story, though he avoided the word autobiography. The narrator, Jacques Cormery, would be a stand-in for himself, a boy born into poverty in colonial Algeria, growing up without a father, raised by a quiet and unlettered mother. Through Jacques' eyes, the novel would trace the contours of a life shaped by hardship, but illuminated by small, stubborn joys. In this return, Camus was not seeking to resolve the political conflict that had torn his homeland apart. He knew such resolution was beyond the power of literature. What he sought, instead, was to preserve the texture of a world that was vanishing. A world of simple dignity, where survival was an everyday act of courage, and where beauty existed not in spite of hardship, but alongside it. Writing The First Man was unlike any project he had undertaken. His earlier works, even when personal in theme, had maintained a certain distance between author and narrator. Here the barrier thinned. He wrote with the intimacy of someone opening a family album, each image carrying the weight of a life lived and remembered. The boy walks to school through unpaved streets, the teacher who recognized a spark of promise, the mother's quiet labour, her bent back, her silence at the dinner table. The act of writing seemed to draw him physically closer to Algeria, even when he was in Paris or in the countryside. He travelled south when he could, sometimes slipping quietly into Algiers to visit his mother. These visits were bittersweet. The city of his memory was still there, the white buildings against the blue bay, the smell of the port, but it was now shadowed by checkpoints, patrols, and the ever-present tension of war. Friends from his youth had taken sides. Some had vanished entirely. Camus moved cautiously in these visits. His fame and his position on the conflict made him a figure both respected and resented. But the streets of his childhood still recognized him, even if they no longer embraced him fully. He would walk past the apartment buildings of Belcourt, past the market stalls, past the school where he had first learned to read. Each corner seemed to speak to him, not in the voice of politics, but in the language of memory. Back in France, the work on The First Man deepened. He envisioned it as the first volume of a larger cycle, perhaps mirroring Proust in its scope, but rooted in a harsher, poorer reality. Through Jacques Cormery, he wanted to explore not only his own childhood, but also the broader question of identity, what it meant to belong to a place that was itself contested, claimed by two cultures, two histories, each unable to fully acknowledge the other. The writing was demanding, both emotionally and physically. His health, never robust, was often an obstacle. Tuberculosis still lurked in the background, forcing him into rest when the work demanded momentum. And yet, there was a vitality in the pages he produced. The sentences carried the clarity of someone speaking directly from the source, without ornament or pretense. He returned again and again to the figure of the mother. In life, Catherine Camus remained an almost silent presence, gentle, hard-working, and nearly deaf. In The First Man, her counterpart was the centre of gravity, a woman whose quiet endurance shaped everything in the boy's world. Through her, Camus paid tribute not only to his own mother, but to the countless women like her, whose strength was unrecorded by history, yet indispensable to survival. The novel also allowed him to confront the absence of his father. Lucien Camus had died in the first months of World War I, a man Albert never knew. In The First Man, Jacques Commery visits his father's grave, reading the dates on the stone and realizing with a shock that the man had been younger at death than Jacques is now. This moment, drawn directly from Camus' own life, was one of those rare intersections where personal grief became universal, where the reader felt the raw, disorienting recognition that our parents were once younger than ourselves. In exploring these memories, Camus was also writing against erasure. He knew that the Algeria of his childhood would not survive the war intact. Whatever came after, independence, continued conflict, something else entirely, it would be a different country. The mixed neighbourhoods, the shared markets, the fragile coexistence between cultures, however flawed, would likely be swept away. By setting it down in prose, he hoped to preserve a fragment of what had been. But as the novel grew, so too did the demands of the present. The Algerian War continued its brutal course. France was divided not only politically, but emotionally, the conflict touching nearly every family in some way. Camus, despite his desire to focus on his writing, could not entirely withdraw. He still received letters pleading for his support, from French settlers, from Algerian nationalists, from international observers. Each wanted him to lend his voice to their cause. He answered a few, knowing that his refusal to take a side in absolute terms left him vulnerable to the charge of indifference. Yet he was anything but indifferent. The war consumed his thoughts, a constant undertone to his work. By 1959, Camus' circle of trust had narrowed. He kept close only to a few friends, among them the writer and editor Pascal Piat, who had stood with him during the resistance. With Piat, he could speak openly, without the fear of his words being twisted for political use. They talked about literature, about the theatre, about the absurdity of their own positions in a world that often seemed to value noise over truth. In his quieter moments, Camus reflected on the paradox of his situation. He had been given the Nobel Prize for illuminating the human conscience, yet here he was, unable to influence the course of the war that threatened the people and places he loved most. The recognition of his work had not translated into power, and perhaps, he thought, that was for the best. A writer's role was not to dictate the future, but to bear witness to the present. Still, the helplessness weighed on him. Work on The First Man continued, though slowly. He spoke of the novel to friends with a kind of guarded hope, describing it as his most important work yet. It was, he said, the book he had always meant to write, the one that would explain him, if anything could. He knew it was a departure from the philosophical novels that had made his name. It was more intimate, less concerned with abstract ideas than with the specific, tangible details of a life. The heat of a summer afternoon, the sound of a school bell, the taste of olives from a street vendor's cart. In early 1960, he planned to take a short trip to the south of France, carrying with him a briefcase filled with manuscripts and notes for the novel. He spoke of it casually, as though it were merely another journey in a life that had seen many. But the briefcase, heavy with pages, was more than luggage. It was the vessel of years of memory, thought, and labour. He could not know that these pages, unfinished and unpolished, would outlive him, or that The First Man, incomplete as it was, would one day be read as his farewell, not to fame nor to philosophy, but to the place and people who had formed him. For now, Camus pressed on, moving between the demands of the present and the pull of the past, trying to shape both into sentences that would hold. The road ahead was still open. The story was not yet done. But winter had a way of closing roads when least expected, and somewhere, just beyond the reach of his vision, an ending was already waiting. The first days of January 1960 arrived with a brittle kind of cold, the kind that sharpens the air until every breath feels edged. Albert Camus had spent the holiday in the south of France, away from Paris's damp winter, visiting friends in the village of Lourmarin. The town, with its stone houses and cypress-lined roads, offered a gentler pace, and Camus had taken to walking the surrounding hills, often with a notebook in his coat pocket. He was not a man who ever truly stopped working. Even in rest, sentences would come to him, half-formed, waiting to be carried home. He had intended to return to Paris by train. That was his habit. He had no love of long car journeys, finding them tedious and vaguely dangerous. But his friend and publisher, Michel Gallimard, suggested they drive instead. Gallimard's new Facile Vega, sleek and powerful, was a temptation, and the idea of an unhurried trip north, with stops along the way, had its appeal. It would allow them to talk, to share the road without the interruptions of crowded train compartments and station timetables. Camus agreed, almost casually. Later, those who knew him would replay this decision as though it were a scene in one of his own novels, a choice so small at the moment, yet weighted with consequence in hindsight. On the morning of January 4th, the car left Lourmarin under a sky pale with winter light. Camus sat in the front passenger seat. Gallimard drove. Gallimard's wife and daughter were in the back. In Camus's briefcase, tucked behind the front seat, were the handwritten pages of The First Man, along with notes, letters, and drafts. It was not the sum of his life's work, but it was perhaps the most personal part of it, the work in which he had finally begun to speak without the armour of fiction. The road north wound through countryside still bare from the season. Trees stood skeletal against the horizon, their branches etched in dark lines. Villages passed in moments, clusters of stone and shuttered windows, smoke rising from chimneys into the cold air. Inside the car, conversation flowed easily. Gallimard and Camus spoke of publishing plans, of upcoming theatre projects, of mutual friends in Paris. Now and then, Camus would lapse into quiet, watching the road unwind before them, his thoughts drifting to the work waiting for him at his desk. By midday, they were making good time. The Facile Vega's engine hummed with an assurance that seemed to erase the idea of danger. But the winter roads were treacherous in their own way, patches of damp from melted frost, sudden curves that demanded precision. Near the small town of Villeblevin, in the Yonne region, the car approached a long, straight stretch of road bordered by tall plane trees. What happened next was both instantaneous and irreversible. Witnesses would later speak of the car moving at high speed, of a sudden loss of control, of the vehicle skidding toward the trees. In a matter of seconds, the Facile Vega struck one of the trunks with such force that it crumpled the front end like paper. The sound, a shattering of metal, glass and wood, carried across the winter air. The impact killed Camus instantly. Michel Gallimard was gravely injured and would die days later in the hospital. Gallimard's wife and daughter survived, though badly shaken. The briefcase was recovered from the wreckage, its contents miraculously intact, pages fluttering in the cold wind. News of the accident spread quickly. In Paris, in Algiers, in Stockholm, in New York, wherever his books had been read, people woke to the headline that Albert Camus was dead at 46. The shock was not only in the loss, but in the manner of it. This was not the long illness that had always seemed to shadow him, nor the violent end some feared might come from his political stances. It was, absurdly, a car accident, a sudden, senseless erasure on an ordinary winter road. For those who had followed his work, the irony was inescapable. Here was the man who had written of the absurd, of life's unpredictability, of the necessity to live fully in the face of death's certainty, now gone in a moment that seemed to mock all human plans. The philosopher of the absurd, undone by the random cruelty he had so often described. In Lourmarin, the village he had chosen as his retreat, the news fell like frost. Locals remembered seeing him only days before, walking the lanes with a thoughtful, almost shy smile, greeting people in the bakery, pausing to admire the winter light on the hills. Now the house stood quiet, its windows dark, the life inside abruptly ended. In Algeria, the reaction was complicated. For some, he had been a moral voice, however contested. For others, especially in the midst of the war, he had been a figure of division, unwilling to give his full allegiance to independence. But even among those who had disagreed with him, there was an acknowledgement of loss. Camus had been, in his way, a son of the country, its light and sea imprinted on every page he wrote. In Paris, the literary world gathered in mourning. Friends, rivals, admirers, and critics alike spoke of his clarity, his moral courage, his stubborn refusal to bend to the winds of ideology. Sartre, despite their bitter estrangement, offered words of respect, recognizing the seriousness with which Camus had approached the human condition. The Nobel laureate, who had so often stood apart, was in death surrounded by the voices of those who had once argued fiercely against him. The funeral was held in Lourmarin, in the quiet of the village cemetery. The January sky was pale and cold, the kind of winter light that seems to bleach the edges of the world. His mother, frail and silent, sat near the front, her face unreadable to those around her. Friends carried the coffin, simple and unadorned, to its resting place. The sea was far away now, but in the stillness some could almost hear it, a faint echo, as if the Mediterranean had followed him here. The briefcase containing the first man was given to his widow, Francine. She understood the weight of what it held. The manuscript, incomplete, would not be published until decades later, when their daughter Catherine prepared it for the world. When it did appear, readers would see in it the intimacy of a man writing not for the public, but for himself, for the boy he had been, for the mother he had loved, for the father he had never known. In the days after his death, tributes poured in. Newspapers reprinted passages from The Myth of Sisyphus, from The Plague, from The Rebel. Again and again the lines returned. In the midst of winter I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. To those who mourned him, the phrase felt like a final gift, a reminder that even in loss there is something in the human spirit that resists the cold. But for those who had known him closely, the absence was sharper. Pascal Piat, his oldest friend, said little publicly, preferring silence over eulogy. Francine, left to raise their children alone, kept her grief private. And in Algeria, Catherine Camus lived on, carrying the knowledge that her son had died far from the place of his birth, yet never far from it in his heart. The road at Villeblevin remained, the scar of the collision visible for years in the bark of the tree. Travellers passing by would sometimes stop, knowing the story, perhaps to stand in the spot where the Fahrzeilwagen had left the pavement. The place became, in its way, a quiet memorial, not marked by a monument, but by the knowledge of what had ended there. Camus had once written that death is the only reality, but he had also written that it is not enough to acknowledge death. One must live as though it does not diminish the value of life. In that sense, his own end, however sudden, was only the final punctuation in a life that had been lived according to that conviction. He had written what he believed, and he had lived what he wrote. To resist injustice, to embrace the beauty of the present, to accept the absurd without surrendering to it. The winter road had taken him, but it had not taken his voice. That remained, in the novels, in the essays, in the fragments of the first man, as clear and steady as the Mediterranean light he had carried from childhood. And yet, for those who had loved him, there would always be the thought of that morning in January and the choice of the car over the train. A small decision, like so many in life, whose meaning can only be seen from the far side of the horizon. The horizon, for Camus, had always been where the sea met the sky. Now it was something else, a line he had crossed, leaving the rest of us to stand at the shore, looking toward a light that seemed at once blinding and impossibly distant. The news had been carried by telegraph, by radio, by the hushed voices of neighbours leaning in close. Albert Camus was gone. The shock of it still hung in the air like smoke. But as winter passed into spring, the silence that followed his death began to shift into something else, a reckoning, both public and private, with the man and his work. In Paris, the first wave was grief. Writers, critics, and journalists who had once sparred with him now wrote of their admiration. Sartre, his old adversary, spoke of him as the most important force in French letters. Newspapers published excerpts from the myth of Sisyphus, the plague, and the rebel, as if trying to distill his life into a few resonant lines. But the second wave was more complicated. It was the work of placing Camus in history, of deciding what his legacy would mean, and for whom. The Nobel Prize had already fixed him in the public imagination as a moral writer, a man of conscience in a century too often compromised. But Camus had resisted such labels in life, wary of the way they simplified and domesticated thought. In death, however, he had no control over the narrative. Tributes emphasized the clarity of his prose, the courage of his resistance years, and his role as a voice against totalitarianism. Fewer mentioned the isolation, the self-doubt, the unfinished arguments left trailing through his notebooks. Meanwhile, in Algeria, the war raged on. For the French government, Camus' passing was a loss, but not one that altered their course. For the FLN, it was the death of a man whose refusal to support their armed struggle outright had made him, at best, a reluctant ally. Yet among ordinary Algerians, especially those who remembered his early journalism on poverty and injustice, there was a quieter mourning, tinged with the recognition that Camus had carried their country's light into the eyes of the world, even if he had never stood fully on one side. The manuscript of The First Man rested in the hands of Francine Camus. She understood its weight, but the rawness of grief made it impossible to think about publication. The pages were personal, unfinished, revealing a man far more vulnerable than the public intellectual known from the lecture halls. They spoke of a childhood steeped in poverty and silence, of the tenderness between mother and son, of the ache of an absent father. Publishing it would mean showing the world not only Camus's craft, but his most intimate self. In the months that followed, friends and colleagues came to Lourmarin, the village where he was buried. Some came to pay respects at the grave, a simple stone set among the cypresses. Others came to sit in the house where he had lived, where his desk still held pens and papers, where books remained open to the last page he had read. It was as though his presence lingered in the dust motes drifting through the winter light. The literary world, for all its rivalries, moved quickly to protect and preserve his works. Editions of his novels and essays were reprinted, sometimes with new introductions by critics eager to stake a claim on interpreting his legacy. In universities, seminars examined his philosophy of the absurd, his ideas of rebellion and justice. Young writers discovered him for the first time, drawn to the elegance of his sentences and the moral clarity of his stance against the death penalty, torture, and political fanaticism. But there was also the danger he had always feared, that his name would be turned into a monument. Monuments, he had written, risk turning the living complexity of a person into a single, static idea. They can inspire, yes, but they can also suffocate. Camus had resisted being called a philosopher in the formal sense, preferring artist or writer. Yet in death he was claimed by philosophers, by political theorists, by novelists. each presenting their own version of him. The Cold War context sharpened this process. To the anti-communist West, Camus became a symbol of principled resistance to Soviet authoritarianism. To others, he was a reminder of the moral responsibility to resist all forms of oppression, regardless of ideology. In Eastern Europe, dissidents read him secretly, finding in his rejection of violence a way to imagine freedom without reproducing the machinery of terror. Meanwhile, in Algeria, the war edged toward its brutal conclusion. By 1962, independence was achieved, but the cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands dead, communities uprooted, wounds that would last for generations. In this new Algeria, Camus occupied an uneasy place. He was neither entirely embraced nor wholly rejected. His love for the country was unquestionable, but his reluctance to endorse the revolution in absolute terms left a shadow over his memory there. In France, the political quarrels faded slowly, but his books remained. The Stranger continued to find new readers each year, its detached narrator still provoking questions about morality and meaning. The Plague, once read as an allegory of Nazi occupation, began to be read in broader terms, as a study of human solidarity in the face of any collective crisis. His essays, especially Reflections on the Guillotine, were cited in campaigns against capital punishment. For those who had known him personally, the most enduring memory was not of the public figure, but of the private man. His quick, wry humour, his love of football matches, his habit of carrying a notebook to jot down a sudden phrase. Pascal Piat remembered long walks with Camus through the streets of Paris, conversations that meandered from literature to politics, to the absurd beauty of a sunset over the Seine. Others recalled the way he spoke of the sea, as if it were not a place, but a living companion. Francine kept his home in Lourmarin, much as it had been. She raised their children away from the glare of the public, ensuring that their father's legacy would be on the page, not in the gossip columns. Catherine Camus, their daughter, grew into the role of literary executor, guarding the unpublished works until the time was right. That time would come decades later, in 1994, when The First Man was finally published. Readers discovered in it a Camus stripped of the intellectual armour that had defined his public life. Here was the boy in the schoolyard, the son visiting his father's grave, the young man feeling the pull of the sea. The novel did not offer the philosophical conclusions of his earlier work. Instead, it offered moments, sharp, sensory, alive. It was as if the man who had written so much about the absurd had, in the end, chosen to leave not an answer, but a life. The release of The First Man reshaped how many saw him. It revealed that beneath the clear, stoic sentences of the public writer was a private tenderness, a loyalty to memory that no political battle could erase. It reminded readers that Camus's moral vision was not abstract. It was rooted in the concrete experience of growing up poor, in a colonized land, with love and dignity the only inheritances of real worth. In the decades since his death, Camus's work has outlived the Cold War, the ideological frameworks that once sought to claim or dismiss him. He is read now in contexts he could never have imagined, by students confronting climate change, by protesters resisting authoritarianism, by readers in countries where his books were once banned. The absurd remains, as he said it would, but so too does the human capacity to meet it with defiance and grace. And yet, even as his influence endures, there is something stubbornly elusive about him. No single interpretation holds. He was at once a man of the left and a critic of its excesses, a lover of justice and a defender of personal limits, a son of Algeria and a citizen of France. He spoke of the invincible summer within, but he also knew the long winters of exile, illness, and political isolation. To read him closely is to be reminded that a person cannot be reduced to the slogans made in their name. In Louramarin, his grave remains simple, the stone weathered by decades of sun and rain. Visitors still come, some to leave flowers, others to sit in silence, perhaps with a copy of The Stranger or The Plague in hand. The cypress trees sway above, their shadows shifting with the day. It is not a grand monument, but it is fitting. Camus had always valued the modest, the unadorned, the honest. After the silence of his passing, there was, and still is, a voice. Not the voice of speeches or manifestos, but the voice in the reader's mind when they reach the end of a page, when they set the book down and feel, for a moment, that strange mixture of clarity and uncertainty that his work so often leaves behind. That is where he lives now, not in marble statues or ideological claims, but in the pause between sentences, in the light that lingers after the words are gone. The phrase had followed him for years, printed in essays, underlined in books, quoted in speeches. In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer. It was perhaps the most famous line Albert Camus ever wrote, and it had the quality of a riddle. To some, it was an affirmation of hope in dark times. To others, it was a quiet defiance, a statement of survival rather than optimism. For Camus, it had been neither slogan nor ornament. It was a personal truth, drawn from the core of his own life. After his death, the phrase took on a life of its own. It appeared on memorials, in sympathy cards, in political speeches, its original context often forgotten. But to understand it fully, one had to return to the landscapes that shaped him. The light and heat of the Mediterranean, the sea breaking against the Algerian coast, the long afternoons when the air shimmered with a golden stillness. These were not just settings in his work. They were the source of that invincible summer, the inner warmth that endured even through war, illness, and exile. Camus's summers were not idle seasons. Even as a boy, there had been times of work, helping with errands, wandering the streets, learning the geography of his neighbourhood. But there were also times of sensory abundance. He would swim in the sea, dive under waves, and feel the salt sting his eyes. He would play football on dusty lots until the light began to fade, the ball kicking up small clouds of earth. He would walk along the port, watching fishermen haul in nets heavy with the day's catch. These images remained with him long after he left Algeria. They were part of the mental archive he drew from when the world turned cold. In his novels, summer often arrives like a revelation. In The Stranger, the sun is an oppressive force, yet it is also inescapable, both a physical presence and a kind of fate. In The Plague, the heat intensifies the sense of confinement, but it also reminds the characters of life beyond the epidemic. Camus understood that light was not purely benevolent, it could be as well as illuminating, but it was always real, and its reality grounded him. Friends often remarked on how deeply he noticed the physical world, a change in the colour of the sky, the smell of rain on dust, the warmth of a cafe's window in winter. These details were never trivial to him. They were proof of the world's immediacy, its refusal to be reduced to theory. This attention was, in its way, a discipline. It kept him from drifting too far into abstraction, tethering his thought to the tangible. The endless summer was not about denying winter. Camus never shied away from acknowledging death, suffering, or injustice. He had seen enough of all three to know their weight. Rather, the summer was what remained when one faced those truths without turning away. It was the stubborn core that refused to yield to despair, the capacity to feel the sun on one's face, even in the colder season. In the years after his death, readers found in this image a personal compass. For those living under political oppression, it became a metaphor for the inner life that could not be confiscated. For those facing illness or loss, it was a reminder that beauty was still possible, even if fleeting. Teachers used it in classrooms. Activists carried it into protests. Lovers wrote it in letters. The phrase became both universal and personal, belonging to anyone who needed it. But the endless summer was also an ethic, a way of living that Camus had practiced long before he named it. It was there in his resistance work, where the risk of arrest or death did not extinguish his commitment to truth. It was there in his journalism, when he wrote about the poor of Kabylia with the same care he gave to philosophical essays. It was there in his refusal to let ideology override compassion, even when that refusal cost him friendships and political allies. Some critics misread this ethic as passivity, as a reluctance to commit. They wanted the clarity of total allegiance, the simplicity of a single flag. Camus offered instead a stubborn humanism, messy, nuanced, unwilling to sacrifice individuals for the sake of abstractions. The summer he carried was not a rallying cry. It was a private fire, sustaining but not ostentatious. In The First Man, that fire is woven through the memories of childhood. Jacques Cormery walks barefoot along hot pavements, feels the cool relief of sea water, and hears the creak of his grandmother's rocking chair in the dim shade of the apartment. These moments are not escapes from reality. They are reality, as valid and as formative as the larger historical forces at work. By preserving them in prose, Camus was preserving the truth that a life is made as much from small, sensory moments as from grand events. The endless summer was also bound to the idea of limits, a concept central to Camus's thought. Summer has its boundaries. It cannot last forever in the world outside. It returns each year, but always in its time. In the same way, Camus believed that human action must acknowledge its limits, that the pursuit of justice must not cross into the territory of cruelty, that rebellion must not become domination. To carry summer within was to understand that warmth does not require burning others. There is a paradox in how this image has endured. Camus himself died in winter, on a road lined with bare trees. He had not yet reached the age when people begin to speak of their final years. The unfinished manuscript in his briefcase was, in some ways, an act of return, his own journey back into the landscapes of summer. That return was interrupted, but the fragments that survive still radiate the heat of his earliest memories. Visitors to his grave in Lourmarin sometimes bring small stones, a tradition from Jewish mourning rituals, though Camus was not Jewish. Others bring copies of his books, worn and underlined, or simply sit in the shade of the cypresses, letting the Provençal sun filter through. In summer, the air there carries the sound of cicadas, the same sound that would have filled his childhood streets in Algiers. The seasons turn, but the sensory world that sustained him is still present for those who know how to see it. The idea of an invincible summer has found its way into art, music, and film. Painters have tried to capture it in Mediterranean blues and ochres. Songwriters have set it to melodies that swell with warmth. Filmmakers have used it as a motif for resilience. Each adaptation reshapes it, but the core remains, that there is a season within us that resists the frost. And yet, Camus would likely remind us that this summer is not a gift from fate. It is made day by day in the way one chooses to live. It is built in moments of attention, in noticing the light on a wall, in speaking truth when silence would be safer, in holding to compassion when anger would be easier. It is not triumph, it is persistence. As the 20th century moved on, as new wars came and went, as ideologies rose and fell, the phrase kept surfacing. It was quoted in the solidarity movement in Poland, in anti-apartheid speeches in South Africa, in student protests from Latin America to Asia. It crossed languages and borders with ease, perhaps because it spoke not of a specific struggle, but of the inner resource needed for any struggle. In the end, the endless summer is less about weather than about stance. It is the refusal to let winter have the final word. It is the memory of warmth carried through cold, the knowledge that the world is worth loving even when it is unworthy of trust. For Camus, it was not a philosophical conclusion, but a lived reality, tested in the deserts of Algeria, in the streets of occupied Paris, in the isolations of fame and illness. When we read those words now, we are not simply recalling a line from a book. We are entering into the space he left for us, a space where the seasons of the world and the seasons of the self meet. It is an invitation, quiet but insistent, to find in our own lives that place where the light remains and to guard it. Because winter will always come. But so too will summer. And the summer within us need not end. Light was always at the centre of Albert Camus' world, not the abstract light of metaphysics, nor the cold light of reason alone, but the tangible, living light of the Mediterranean. It was the light that warmed the walls of his childhood home in Algiers, that glinted on the sea when he swam as a boy, that filtered through olive trees in the afternoons of his youth. And it was the same light that decades later still illuminated the pages of his novels, essays and plays, even when those works spoke of plague, exile and death. To speak of Camus without speaking of light is to miss something essential. For him, it was never simply a backdrop. Light was a way of seeing, a way of inhabiting the world. It revealed beauty, yes, but also truth, stripping away illusions as the midday sun strips shadows from a wall. In his writing, light often arrives with a kind of moral force, exposing not only the landscape, but the soul. In The Stranger, the sun is relentless, pressing down on the protagonist until it becomes almost unbearable, a physical weight that shapes action. In The First Man, light is gentler, memory-soaked, suffused with the tenderness of a son's gaze upon his mother. For Camus, light could be harsh or merciful, but it was always honest. It told you what was there, whether you wanted to see it or not. The light that remains is not just a poetic image, it is what survives when the rest falls away. After Camus's sudden death, what remained for the world was his body of work, the novels that had made him famous, the essays that had stirred fierce debate, the plays that tested his ideas in the crucible of performance. But beyond the pages, what remained was a way of looking at life, a sensibility attuned to both its beauty and its injustice. That sensibility was born in poverty, sharpened by illness, tested in war, and refined in the long, lonely labour of writing. Camus never claimed to offer final answers. What he offered instead was a method, to face the absurd without surrender, to love the world without denying its flaws, to refuse the seduction of hatred even when hatred seemed justified. His light was not a blinding beacon. It was a steady flame, one that could be carried through the dark. In the decades after his death, the world changed in ways he could not have predicted. The Cold War ended, new conflicts arose, colonial empires collapsed, new forms of oppression took their place. Climate change emerged as a crisis. Technology transformed the speed and shape of human life. And yet readers kept returning to Camus, not because his works addressed these specific events, but because his approach to life seemed, somehow, always relevant. When the COVID-19 pandemic swept the globe in the early 21st century, sales of The Plague surged. Readers in lockdown recognised in Oran's quarantined streets their own isolation, their own longing for connection. They saw in Dr. Rieux's quiet, persistent work a model for how to live in the face of an indifferent threat. Camus had written about a fictional epidemic as an allegory for Nazi occupation. 80 years later, it read like a manual for endurance. This is the strange durability of the light he left. It bends to new circumstances without breaking. His insistence on truth, on limits, on compassion over ideology applies whether the enemy is political, biological, or existential. That flexibility comes from the fact that his philosophy was rooted not in systems, but in lived experience. He never tried to trap the world in a single theory. Instead, he kept his gaze on what could be seen, felt, and touched. The light also remains in the personal testimonies of those who knew him. Friends spoke of his laughter, quick, genuine, often self-deprecating. They remembered his love of football, his skill on the field, and his appreciation for the camaraderie it fostered. They recalled evenings in cafes, where conversation ranged from literature to the fate of Europe, from the ethics of rebellion to the beauty of a well-played pass in a match. For all his seriousness on the page, in person, he could be playful, even boyish, with a warmth that surprised those who knew only his public persona. And then there is the light in the work itself, the clarity of his prose, short, precise sentences, images drawn from the sea, the sun, the earth, has a transparency that allows the reader to see through it into their own life. He wrote in a style that was deceptively simple, refusing the ornament that might obscure meaning. That simplicity was not an absence of depth. It was the result of stripping away everything that was not essential. In his later years, Camus feared that the world was moving toward extremes, that the space for dialogue and moderation was shrinking. He saw it in politics, in the intellectual scene, in the war in Algeria. His insistence on preserving that space often cost him dearly, but it was also part of the light he carried, the belief that one could oppose injustice without becoming unjust, that one could fight without losing sight of the human face of the opponent. The light that remains is not without shadows. Camus's life was marked by contradictions, between his public ideals and his private choices, between his longing for justice and his reluctance to endorse certain struggles, between his love for Algeria and his inability to align himself fully with its independence movement. These contradictions are part of what makes his work enduring. It does not present a flawless hero, but a human being grappling with the same tensions that shape all lives. In Lourmarin, where he is buried, the Provençal sun still falls on the cypress trees that line the cemetery. Visitors walk the narrow path to his grave, some bringing flowers, others bringing nothing but the wish to stand for a moment in silence. There is no grand monument, no elaborate epitaph, only a stone with his name, the dates of his life, and the landscape around it. It is fitting. Camus wrote often of the beauty of the ordinary, of the dignity in simple things. His final resting place reflects that. And yet, his reach extends far beyond that quiet plot of land. In classrooms across the world, students encounter the stranger and wrestle with Meursault's detachment, with the sunlit scene on the beach that ends in violence. In civic debates, his arguments against the death penalty resurface, challenging the idea that justice can be served by killing. In art, his themes echo rebellion, exile, solidarity, reshaped by each new generation of creators. There is a story told by some who worked with him at combat during the war. They remember the small, windowless rooms where the underground paper was printed, the smell of ink, the constant fear of discovery. Camus would arrive with an editorial in hand, calm but determined. He would read it aloud, not with oratorical flourish, but with a steady voice as if to say, "These words are not weapons. They are tools. We use them to build something that will outlast the night." That is perhaps the clearest image of the light he carried, not a blaze meant to burn, but a flame meant to endure. In the end, what remains of Albert Camus is not only his work, but the way his work teaches us to look without flinching at what is unjust, to look without cynicism at what is beautiful, to look at the world as it is, and still choose to live in it fully. This is the light that survives winter, the light that does not vanish even when the road ends unexpectedly. We cannot know what he would have written had he lived longer. The first man might have been completed its planned scope realized. He might have turned to new forms, new subjects. He might have found new ways to speak of the same eternal questions. But perhaps the incompleteness is part of the legacy. It reminds us that life itself is always unfinished, that the light we leave behind is rarely the one we planned. Camus once wrote that the purpose of life is to live it as fully as possible, to be faithful to the earth. That fidelity, neither blind optimism nor surrender, shines through everything he left. It is there in the early stories of Algerian streets, in the wartime editorials, in the philosophical essays, in the late, tender fragments of his final novel. It is there in the fact that his words still reach across decades to speak to strangers he never met. The light that remains is not only his, it is the light he helped others to see in themselves. And like the sun on the Mediterranean, it is strongest when it falls on the ordinary. A street in the afternoon, a sea touched by wind, a voice speaking quietly but clearly against the noise. The seasons will turn, winters will come, but somewhere, always, the light will remain.